G'day, H. Mahara here. In two previous videos, I've talked about codependence, kryptonite. So one was borderline emotional radioactivity is codependent kryptonite. And the other one is BPD breakups, no closure, codependent rescuers kryptonite. I think it was on that video. Commenter left a question that I really hadn't thought of it this way before. And that question was, what would be considered borderline kryptonite? And the answer is each person with borderline personality's kryptonite is internal, and then it becomes externalized and mixed with the codependent kryptonite of the emotional radioactivity of people with untreated BPD, of the codependent trying to rescue the person with untreated BPD. Borderline kryptonite is not the antithesis of something like codependent kryptonite rather is for those with codependency, because you can turn away from that kryptonite, back away as it's warning you to do, a la Superman, the rescuing hero. You can pull away, and it can be it's the antithesis of the direction in which people with codependency need to go. Borderline kryptonite is the antithesis of having a self. It is at the center, internally, of a person with borderline personality, especially untreated. It's at the core center of no self, lack of self, loss of self. It's at the core there. It's internal. Borderline kryptonite is internal, and it manifests externally. But borderline kryptonite is first the loss of self, no emotional skin, extreme emotional sensitivity, and no skills. No one that taught them, in 87% of people diagnosed with BPD, how to regulate their emotions or how to handle life in any way, shape, or form. Borderline kryptonite is not the antithesis of the same antithesis that it seems to be when we talk about it the other way around, right? Codependent kryptonite with a person with BPD, you're in the superhero rescuer role. People with BPD are in a I don't know who I am kind of agony, and that is their kryptonite. So people with BPD are not ever comfortable inside themselves. They don't have a self to be comfortable within. They have no sense of self, no stable sense of identity. That's why they're chameleons. That's why they try to please people so hard and get to know them in so many different ways. Well, they're only going to hurt them, but they don't do that on purpose. Borderline kryptonite is what broke apart the fragmented ego in the arrested emotional development before, often, and by the age of 2. Borderline kryptonite is internal, inside, like on fire inside of the borderline. That's borderline kryptonite, and it emanates outwardly and subsumes all who get too close to that emptiness, to that lost self, to the kryptonite of the borderline, which is the cry of who am I? Borderline kryptonite is within the center of that emptiness where the loss of self is inside the borderline. It's not the same as the superhero or the rescuing codependent kryptonite that is, something that when you run into it, which for you might be the borderline, that's your kryptonite. All of the impossibility there for you and these relationships from the outside, right? But for borderline kryptonite comes from deep within, where they're missing self. It's deep. It's something that is so incredibly painful 24/7 for people with BPD who are not in treatment and have had no treatment. They live with their kryptonite inside every minute of every day of their lives if they don't get treated. Borderline kryptonite begins with arrested emotional development before or by the age of 2. The relational damage, the loss of self, they're not progressing emotionally, not learning how to communicate, not learning how to reciprocate or be mutual. The borderline's kryptonite is the cycle of repetition compulsions that are the continuous playing out, re-experiencing, being triggered to dysregulated emotions by the past, by the incredible adverse experience that so many, 87% of those diagnosed with borderline personality go through, which doesn't excuse the way that they hurt others in adult relationships. But the borderline's kryptonite is this core woundedness, core wound of abandonment, the lack of attachment or bonding that leads borderline personality to be defined as disorganized attachment style, which really means there isn't an attachment style unless they get significant treatment and or go through therapy all the way to healed and recovered. So borderline kryptonite really is relationships, because they don't have a self. They don't know who they are. They don't have that relationship to and with self to be able to have relationship with anyone else that really works, that's healthy, or in the case of many people with borderline personality, that even lasts. They lose and lose and lose relationships, because they have a lost self. In other words, they don't have a self. So borderline kryptonite is the very painful reality of what they're constantly going through internally. That, sometimes that's thrust out on others, often, right, externally, and in different ways, depending which presentation of borderline personality somebody has. But the borderline's kryptonite is that lack of self, loss of self, the arrested emotional development, and inability to communicate, relate, and have relationships in adult, mutual, reciprocal, healthy ways. And borderline kryptonite extends out then to the fact that they can't love you, they can't attach to you, they can't receive your love, they don't trust. They are people who were ostensibly obliterated in early childhood development by adverse experience and failed parenting. That's borderline kryptonite. And the fact that they don't know how they affect others if they're untreated, they really don't know how they affect you, because they can't see you and they can't hear you because of the object other relating and the woundedness at the core when they were but an infant to a toddler of the first object in their life, and how nothing went right enough in 87% of cases. That's the borderline's kryptonite. That legacy that they carry of not even knowing self and not being able to do relationships in any way that makes any sense. Magical thinking, lacking emotional intelligence, lacking critical thinking skills, especially in relationships, or relating, or communicating, or trying to be close. That's borderline kryptonite. Borderline kryptonite leaves untreated people with BPD, and if they're not significantly treated, leaves people with borderline personality always looking at life and trying to relate, to describe it in an emotional way, or what does it feel like from the inside out? It feels like you're behind a wall of glass, and you're trying to connect, but there's no self for them to connect to anyone else from. That's borderline kryptonite. So borderline kryptonite is also how much they need to be loved, deserve to be loved, want to be loved, want to love, want to be able to relate, want to be able to communicate, want to be able to get along with people, but they can't, and especially if they're untreated. So borderline kryptonite is the inability to connect, is a longing, aching, unconscious, not conscious knowing of continued repetition compulsion cycles, triggered emotional dysregulation by the re-experiencing dissociatively in the here and now of their core woundedness and adverse childhood experiences, which are daunting for most people. For 87% of those diagnosed with BPD, it's a lot of adverse experiences and woundedness to heal. And that's borderline kryptonite. So when I talk about what's the kryptonite for you as a codependent in a relationship, or on the other side of somebody with BPD in any relationship type, there's different factors to it. But for the borderline, central to the whole reason why they have BPD, what that means and how daunting that is in any person's life, and how much suffering that means for them. Borderline kryptonite is loss of self, living and reliving a very young, wounded experience that they're not consciously aware keeps repeating itself. And then trying to relate to others from behind a wall of glass without a self, and they try so hard and they fail just equally as hard. And then other people are hurt, other people are wounded and beyond, and the person with BPD is still running, trying to escape what they're going through 24/7. So when you think that that person that you were with, or you might still be with BPD, or a relative, or a parent, or whomever, if you think they're happy, they're never happy. Untreated, they don't know what happiness is. They can put a lot of different, looks and be chameleons and make things seem this way and the other way. Borderline kryptonite is trying to exist, build relationships, do things in their lives which they can't do without treatment, which they can't do without a known sense of self. So borderline kryptonite is something that it hits at the core of what BPD is, the stigma associated with it, which I don't think that any human being deserves, regardless of their relational difficulties, communication difficulties, deficits, and the fact that they can't relate and they don't understand their impact on others. So, not excusing the behavior, or worse, of those with BPD untreated. But I think it's really important that people, if you think about this borderline kryptonite, this very central reality in their lives, that almost anything and everything that they could want, like any other person, was taken away from them, days, months, weeks after they were born. And it wasn't their fault, and they didn't deserve it. And then they develop all these coping mechanisms, right? The narcissistic infantile defenses, which doesn't mean BPD is NPD, that they needed to survive that friggin' kind of childhood. And then when a person with BPD becomes an adult chronologically and maybe intellectually, but certainly not emotionally, all of those defense mechanisms that worked and that they needed to survive become maladaptive. And until people get treatment, they're going to be living in a multi-layered world of hurt. And borderline kryptonite is love. The giving of love or the receiving of love. Aside from losing self, the borderline kryptonite is this inability to give or receive healthy, consistent, congruent, age-appropriate love, and the inability to attach. And these wounded and very hurt people hurt others. And I'm making no excuse for that. I'm just trying to say, in answering this question, I never thought of it like this. But thinking of it this side of it does bring out the empathy and the compassion that I have for people with BPD. This answer and my description of what borderline kryptonite really is goes so deep. It's everything about what's really going on for people with BPD, and especially the unknown by you aspects of it. What do I mean by that? Unless you have BPD or you have had BPD, you can't know what it feels like from the inside out. Can't know what the drivers of so much behavior that so many with BPD don't want to do, really do care about, but they're drowning inside with a lack of self. That's borderline kryptonite. That everything they want keeps disappearing in front of them because they don't have a self or an understanding untreated of what's happened to them, or how they impact others, or where they begin and end and where you begin or other people begin. That's borderline kryptonite. And so wherever you are in this journey, whether you have BPD or you're somebody, a codependent, an ex, a partner, and on and off again, just try to think about this borderline kryptonite and know they're still responsible for their behavior and for how they've treated you and for maybe why you're not with the person with BPD anymore. And you might still feel a lot for them. Some people do, some people don't. Just try in your own mind today to separate out the wounded young child in them because they're not emotionally adults if they're untreated. Try to separate that wounded, eviscerated individual that never got to be. You fell in love with who you thought they were, but they're really not anybody right now. They don't know who they are. So try to separate that person just with compassion and in your own, wherever you are with this, but in your own attempt to let go and to grow and to heal and recover. Separate their behavior from that wounded non-entity of, quote, lost self, unquote. Because what people with BPD go through inside, yes, you suffer from that. You get hurt on the outside. You get hurt when they externalize it. And the borderline kryptonite is trying to relate with no skills, no ability, no self, from behind a wall of glass. And they want what you want, but they can't do it. They don't know how. That's borderline kryptonite. I don't want people who need to be putting themselves first to be feeling too much compassion for, too much, right? For someone who just hurt you or is an ex now or needs to become one. But borderline kryptonite is pretty, for those who aren't treated, is pretty devastatingly the story of their lives. And it was not their fault. Of course, in adulthood, they're responsible. But no child ever asks for all the failed parenting that the 87% of those who go on to be diagnosed with BPD, which I knew from my narcissistic dysfunctional family of origin. Like I said, I recovered 30 plus years ago, but for about 30 years of my life, lived with that. And I was getting better all the time. I was in therapy for 15 years, but certainly up until the age of 25 or so. So from 0 to 25, I knew nothing but that pain. I was learning some things in my early 20s. But borderline kryptonite is never having had a chance. And then people that are untreated with BPD today won't have a chance unless and until they seek treatment. And as much treatment as it takes to get the healing and recovery work done. To find self, to learn so much, to learn everything and be reparented, and to go through early childhood development in therapy. Maybe when people are 25, 35, 45 years old, they'll be doing some of the work of what should have naturally occurred for them in their life when they were 1 year old, 2 years old, 3 years old, 4 years old, 5 years old. because arrested development, that's borderline kryptonite, and everything flows from that loss of the otherwise burgeoning authentic self. And the only way for a person with BPD to get that lost self, find the authentic self, go through the type of therapy for as long as it takes to be reparented, to grow that self up, they are still going to be people who aren't really known to themselves, let alone able to relate or communicate or get along with others. So borderline kryptonite is their lack of emotional skin, is their loss of self, is the incredible pain, anxiety, and more, and the reliving of adverse childhood experience in dissociative ways that comes flying into the here and now, inside, in ways that you can't even imagine. But yeah, then they externalize it, not on purpose, more often than not on purpose. And they externalize it because they're trying to escape it, and then they hurt others severely. That's borderline kryptonite.